Welcome to the ACE Emerging Professionals webcast, a series of short sessions featuring conversation with a wide range of inspirational speakers on the most challenging topics in our industry. I'm Wojciech Szewczak, Chair for the ACE Emerging Professionals in London and Southeast Region Committee, and I'll be the host for this episode. In today's episode, How to Lead the Way on Climate Change, I'm with Tom Worthington, Sustainability and Carbon Consultant at Atkins, and Chair for the ACE Emerging Professionals Committee in Northwest Region. Tom is also the ACE Emerging Professional representative in the Voice of Consultancy Net Zero Group, answering the biggest question of our time: how society responds to the net zero challenge. We both had an opportunity to attend the United Nations Climate Change COP26 conference in Glasgow, representing the emerging leaders in the construction industry and the Construction Leadership Council's workshop. Thank you for joining me today, Tom.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Wojciech.
I'm looking forward to hearing from you the key insights from the COP26 event and what emerging professionals can do to lead the way on climate change. I would like to start with quite an open question, and considering your strong background in sustainability and carbon, do you think that the world leaders set themselves the ambitious enough actions to meet the net zero targets by 2050?
Sure. So straight in with the big question. So there's of course a few points to consider here. So do bear with me while I talk around the point a little bit. So I don't know about you, Wojciech, but the media that I was seeing around COP certainly to me presented it as a bit of a failure. However, I think that ultimately depended on what you expected going into COP26. So whilst one of the main objectives of COP was to get all countries to commit to a 2050 net zero target, realistically from the start, this was very unlikely to be achievable, as COPs are notoriously slow at delivering environmental change on a global scale, which really highlights how extraordinary Paris was in 2015 that set the famous narrative many of us know to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C, preferably 1.5 degrees C. For context on the challenge of achieving a net zero target by 2050, in 2019, I went to a keynote speech with some of the senior members of the Climate Change Committee, the CCC, just after the Climate Change Act was amended to mandate net zero emissions by 2050 in the UK. Even then, the CCC had to concede that 2050 was a very ambitious target for the UK, a developed G7 nation, and that even with the most optimistic modelling, we only knew how to get around 96% of the way there, and that the final 4% was reliant on some miracle that we hadn't yet predicted. Now place yourself in the position of China, India, much of the developing world, where they don't necessarily have the resources of the developed world, and food, water, sanitation, etc. are enormous challenges that also need addressing immediately. Then suddenly setting a target at 2050 or after seems even more ambitious than we have done in the UK, which China has done for carbon neutrality by 2060 and India has done for 2070. There was, however, a lot of very promising pledges and commitments made at COP26, which set a new precedent for the years ahead. Money amassing into the trillions of dollars was rallied around climate causes. Deforestation pledges now protect over 91% of the forested world, and the potent greenhouse gas methane has been targeted specifically. Issues of gender equality, race, and the voices of young people were heard for the first time, and finally a fossil fuel, coal, was explicitly mentioned in a COP agreement, albeit the terminology slightly watered down at the 11th hour. But if all the pledges and commitments made at COP26 are met, noting that is a very big if, then global warming is currently modelled to achieve 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is the first time I've ever seen modelling realistically show it below 2 degrees C. Now, nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, of greenhouse gases will also now be revised every 2 years. This was previously every 5, and this will be starting at next year's COP in Egypt to shift the dial that bit closer to 1.5 degrees C. Because as we know from the latest IPCC reports, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 is alarming. So it's brilliant to see that we've already made a good shift towards that.
That was a great summary what actually happened behind the closed doors at COP26 event. But I just wanted to move now a little bit more towards our industry. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we had an opportunity to attend the Construction Leadership Council's workshop and take part in the discussion on the construction industry's global role in collectively reducing the emissions targets and overcoming the net zero challenge. So what are your key insights from the workshop at COP26?
Well, the high-profile CLC session made it very clear the scale of the challenge the construction industry has to overcome in order to address the 38% of global emissions it is solely responsible for, as the industry builds the equivalent to a city the size of Paris every week. The CLC stated that over £500 billion is required to adequately insulate the UK's building stock alone, and that if concrete was a nation, it would be the 3rd highest emission nation globally. The leaders of industry gave some enlightening perspectives on how the industry is tackling this from both a top-down and bottom-up perspective. Mike Chaldecott, the CEO of Saint-Gobain, explained a refreshingly transparent approach he has brought to net zero, where all 45 of the UK factories that Saint-Gobain operate have net zero roadmaps that are reviewed every 6 months, and that all employees were invited for the opportunity to challenge him personally on this issue. My CEO, Atkins CEO Richard Robinson, discussed the need to make carbon visible using big data and artificial intelligence to better understand our own extremely varied building stock. While Lara Young, the Group Climate Change Director for Costain, gave a valuable case study of how utilising advanced telematics has recently driven down idling times of plant on the Thames Tideway project by 11%. Hannah Vickers, the Chief of Staff of Mace, gave an enlightening speech discussing the shift change required to move away from traditional construction techniques that are highly unpredictable and time pressured, which often lead to unsustainable choices being made, or sometimes forcibly being made, towards modern methods of construction with digital design, prefabricated building materials, enabling repeatable, optimizable work that minimizes waste and facilitates sustainability. At this session, it was also extremely empowering from an emerging professional perspective to see Sarah Linnell, a sustainability engineer from Cundall, selected to co-chair the session and represent young people alongside the industry leaders, deliver a powerful speech challenging the audience to facilitate a culture to ask the right questions. And that's undoubtedly one of the key roles emerging leaders need to play, being prepared to stand up, challenge the status quo, and ask questions. Young people were, on the whole, given a great platform at COP26 with various young speakers and a whole day where the voices of over 40,000 emerging professionals were heard. So the time to build on this and act really is now.
So I hope you will agree with me that attending the COP26 conference, especially the Construction Leadership Council's workshop, was an opportunity to network and have a conversation with leaders in our industry. So what was the most interesting connection you made, or what was the most interesting conversation you had at COP26?
Well, I'm sure you'd agree, Wojciech, that in the first instance, after 18 months of virtual events, Teams meetings, conferences, etc., it was completely re-energizing to meet with cross-industry colleagues in person, to make new connections, reinforce existing ones, and ultimately appreciate that we're all, one way or another, working towards the same goal of a net zero future. I found that extremely motivational. Therefore, to anyone listening in, I would highly recommend that you all do your best to attend an in-person event or conference to refresh yourself after this long period of virtual interactions. But a notably interesting discussion that took part in the COP Green Zone was surrounding active travel. And this discussed why this needs to be a major priority before we have all transitioned to electric vehicles. So it's already very well documented that charging a decarbonised transport system will be challenging from both an infrastructure and low carbon energy perspective. However, this issue will only be exacerbated once we've overcome the upfront cost of electric vehicles, or once they reach price parity, because they are so cheap to fill up per se and maintain. It is essentially incentivizing people to drive more because it's so cheap to do so. And this, of course, will only worsen congestion, demand more space for parking and putting cars on the roads, put more brake and tire dust into the air, and ultimately stop people being active. So this is, interestingly, a commonly known phenomenon called Jevons paradox, where energy efficiency measures actually lead to an increase overall in energy consumption due to the resulting lower prices. That is attributed as one of the main reasons why global energy consumption has continued to rise throughout time despite global innovations. So a typical example that people can often relate to is using the heating more once you've installed an efficient boiler and lots of insulation, because it's so cheap to do so. So ultimately, the need for active travel to take hold now, before it becomes commonplace to have an electric vehicle, is of paramount importance to aid the transition to a sustainable future transport system.
So I clearly remember that we had this conversation in Glasgow regarding the electric vehicles and also the public transportation, and I'm really glad that actually you brought this to our audience and you shared your insights. Also in our audience, you can find emerging professionals who are passionate about making the difference in natural and built environment, and also people who are very passionate about achieving the net zero by 2050. So in your opinion, what are 3 things emerging leaders can do to lead the way on climate change?
A great question for sure. And so firstly, I suppose it's quite a broad application, but become an ambassador for environmental change through speaking up. And in this instance, I mean, if possible, right to the top of your organizational chain, because, there's so many ways we can all improve sustainability within our job roles, our organizations, the projects we're working on. I was extremely privileged to speak with my CEO whilst at COP26 and discuss the importance of emerging professional representation on strategic sustainability issues, which was a concept, fortunately, my CEO was in complete agreement with, and has resulted in me being able to contribute to some of his meetings. So I think particularly in large organizations, as I say, I'm from Atkins, where there's many layers of hierarchy, often spanning the globe, emerging leaders need to be prepared to speak up and discuss these issues with colleagues at all levels of seniority across the world to have the biggest impact that they can. Secondly, sorry, you wanted a few things, which kind of touched on the last one, is around growing your sphere of influence. So it may be that you already know a lot about sustainability and you want to do more. So if you can pass this on to others and impact their jobs, their projects, their behaviors, then the ripple effect you can have can be enormous. And then finally, which is a really important one, is to become carbon literate amongst, lots of other topical climate related pieces of knowledge, because if we're to educate others and lead the way on this, we need to understand the latest science, best practice and technologies to demonstrate to our existing leaders that emerging professionals deserve a place at the table to address these critical issues and have our voices heard.
Okay, Tom, I think we are out of time, and thank you for sharing your insights. But just to summarize what we discussed in this episode, I think you'll agree with me that the construction industry is moving in the right direction to achieve net zero, and At the workshop organized by the Construction Leadership Council, we experienced that big players in our industry are definitely taking steps to achieving net zero. Also, the role of emerging leaders in tackling the challenge of climate change is extremely important. And also, as emerging leaders, we should take an action and hold our leaders accountable in achieving the net zero targets. Tom, is there anything else you would like to add to this summary?
I think you've summarized really well, Wojciech, but I would just push on. We need to take action. We need to take action now. So as I mentioned earlier, everyone will undoubtedly know ways in which they can improve sustainability across what they do. And so let's act on it.
Okay, thank you for your time and sharing your insights with us. Many thanks for listening. I hope you found our conversation insightful and interesting. Now, we want to hear from you, emerging professionals. What are your thoughts on the topic of achieving net zero by 2050? And we've prepared a question for you. And the question is, do you think that emerging professionals can be influential in achieving the net zero targets in our industry? If yes, do you feel you are provided with all the right tools and training to take an action? Please let us know what are your thoughts in the comment box below. And me, as a host of this episode, I will try to reply to your comments and questions in the following days. You've been listening to the ACE Emerging Professionals webcast. To find out more about the webcast, upcoming episodes and events, visit us on our website and on our LinkedIn page.